Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast by Bangalore International Centre, bringing you conversations that move, inform, and encourage discourse.
That protector comes in because of the economic insecurity angle. That if you don't have a job and if you haven't had a job for a long time, the person who's going to promise you a welfare program and to keep you safe, from, enemies, foreign and domestic, is the one who you're naturally going to support. And so, there's the language of aspiration that's mixed in. But then there's also the lack of awareness that people don't often correlate the fact that they don't have a job with the performance of the government.
That was author and user researcher Vivaan Marwaha talking about his learnings in the process of writing his book, What Millennials Want, in a conversation with writer, poet, and executive director of India Foundation for the Arts, Arundhati Ghosh. India is one of the youngest countries in the world, and the generation of millennials make up for over 400 million people. This is the largest generation of people in the world. That means that the choices and trajectory of this generation have pivotal consequences on local, regional, and global politics and economics. So the important question is, what do Indian millennials want? What are their economic aspirations and their social views? Most importantly, what makes them tick? In What Millennials Want, Vivaan documents the aspirations and anxieties of these young people scattered across more than 30,000 kilometers in 13 Indian states. Combining an expansive dataset along with personal anecdotes, he narrates an intimate biography of India's millennials, investigating their attitudes towards sex, marriage, employment, religion, and politics. This episode of BIC Talks is an extract from the live event that took place in late October 2021 in the BIC premises. Now, over to Arundhati.
I must confess, I didn't know who millennials were. I thought it was people who were born in year 2000 onwards. And then I realized it isn't that. So this book opened up. That was the first thing that I had to learn from the book was millennials are termed as people born between 1981 and 1996. Those who attained young adulthood at the turn of the millennium. So, Vivan, my first question actually to you, I read that you started writing this book, putting this book together in 2018 when you were 22, 23?
22, 23.
And so why this urge to put something like this together? What made you think of this as a subject, as your first book?
Yeah, so when I started this book, I actually didn't even know it was going to be a book. I just started it as a research project to ask some questions because I was working at a think tank in Delhi. And it was a really interesting job. I got to, rub shoulders with a variety of people in politics, in the business world, in the tech community. And I began to realize that, in our confidence in Delhi and in our confidence in Mumbai, we were kind of missing the rest of India. And we didn't fully understand the country and the people we were trying to serve. And so at a policy level, people were designing policies for, but at a business level, people were selling products to, or consumers were trying to acquire. And the way I came upon this realization was my grandparents live in Bhopal. And we call Bhopal, a small town, but it's a city of 1 million people and it's rapidly urbanizing. And I go to Bhopal almost every 6 to 8 weeks. And there's, someone who, lives with in their house, and he's my age. He was getting his MBA while I was finishing up with my undergrad. And then a few weeks later, he was watering my grandmother's lawn. And I asked her, why is he, he just finished his MBA, like, why is he doing this? And she just, very matter of fact told me, yeah, like he's doing this now. He tends to the gardens in the neighborhood. And I began to, that was like a kind of a big wake up call for me because, this is someone who was almost my age. We'd grown up together. and he just finished his MBA, but there were no jobs for him in Bhopal for him to actually use that degree. And now this is, the quality of that degree notwithstanding, the fact that, even in the city where there is a lot of, construction projects, taking place, the fact that, you have so many young people who are just completely unemployed was a big, wake up call to me. And when I went back and I started talking about it, I really began to realize that, we need to be doing much more work in this space. Later in 2019, the election year, in January, the Business Standard newspaper, broke that report of the NSSO job survey that, India was experiencing 45-year high unemployment. And a lot of people were very surprised by that, but I had already done a year of field work. And I would just go to all of these small towns. I was in Mysore, I was in other towns in, Karnataka and South India, and of course, North India. And you just go to these places, and unemployment is just so widespread. The concept of a formal job is actually not that, ingrained or common, that I felt that someone needs to write about this, and what it means for our millennials who are our future. And just India itself has 440 million millennials. And it's the world's largest population of millennials, and it's more than the entire population of the US and Canada combined. So I really wanted to understand, what life is like for the Indian millennial outside of Delhi and Bombay. And what are people's attitudes towards jobs and marriage and sex and religion and politics. So that's kind of where the book comes from.
Okay, so while reading the book, there were a couple of things that I was very surprised and impressed by, Vivan. One is the depth of research. So before we go deep dive, one little question about methodology. What were some of the challenges in writing a book like this, where some data exists, but you're not sure whether that data is everything you want, and you have to go out there and speak to people? But like you're saying, it's 400 million. That's a huge number. How do you even have the confidence to say what I'm picking up is really a picture? So methodology, research, study-wise, what were some of your difficulties?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's something I grappled with a lot naturally while writing the book. Is like, where do you start? Who are you writing about? And is even the interviews that you've done, are they even representative? Because I did 900 interviews, and people in the research world know that that's quite a bit. But 900, in a population of 440 million is nothing. So at some point, you have to decide, like, when is enough, and when enough is enough as well. So for folks who haven't read the book, as Arundhati mentioned, I rely on two principal sources of information. So one is the data set that the CSDS Lokniti project, the youth survey that they put together, which they do every 10 years. And in that youth survey, they have 6,500 respondents. So that's pretty representative. And then my own interviews. And what I did was, so I first went through the survey, I had their raw data, and I looked at the big trends that surprised me. And in many ways, the book buying audience in India, English book buying audience are also people like me, who largely live in urban areas. They want to know more about what's going on, but the media doesn't necessarily provide that kind of information. So to answer your question, I looked at the big findings in the survey that were kind of surprising, and then I sort of tried to validate them in the interviews I was doing. Some individuals I profile in the book actually go against the data. But I say that, these are millennial stories that would not have been able to, take place 20 years ago. So I include them because, these are stories that they might not be representative, but they're very interesting and could have only taken place today.
You break up the book into 5 key chapters. One is education, one is economic aspiration, one is marriage and social views, one is technology and social media, and finally political ideas and attitudes. And so I was wondering, why these? Did you decide that before? Or did you, when you were sitting with all the material, figure out that this is where how the pattern is emerging?
I initially had 4. I broke the social into tech and social media and marriage.
And marriage and social views.
Exactly. Yeah. And, if you look at the millennial existence today, these are sort of the 4 or 5 big things that contribute to daily life. Is that, what is the education you got? And what is the education that millennials got? What job do you have, or what type of job do you want? How do you interact with others in real life and on the internet? And then finally, the big marriage question. education, right? And whether it's an arranged marriage, love marriage, and kind of why it is one of those two. And then politics, because, in India, politics definitely more than other countries determines so much of, daily life over here.
Yeah. So the first chapter is education, and it really breaks your heart to read that chapter. Because what you realize, as Vivan so eloquently and very, I must say, very insightfully has drawn out, is the total failure of the public education system in being unable to reach the millions that it should have. And on the other hand, the private education system being more of a profit-making, quick buck kind of industry. Is private-public partnership a model for the future? How do we crack this? Because you've critiqued both sides, the public sector and the private sector. So where do we go from here?
One of the things I do in the book is I really don't make a lot of predictions or offer solutions because I'm 26 and I feel like there's if you want solutions, there's people who've been doing this work for decades. But what in the conversations I had with those who have been doing this work is that there's one theme that emerges, and I feel many in the audience might relate with, is that in India we have a filtering system that we call an education system. And basically what we're doing is we're filtering students and young Indians towards IIT or IIM or medical school or a government job. And what we're not actually doing is educating people to, really do any of these jobs. And, if you look at Kota in Rajasthan, now Netflix also has a show, Kota Factory, and there's many places like Kota, so in the book I talk about Indore, is that you have, entire industries that have taken over these towns, which is the education industry. And you have, coaching centers and finishing schools and, all types of, private operators who are offering, some type of, silver bullet to, families who really want their kids to enter the middle class or, go beyond. And I think the problem over here is that we're just approaching this the wrong way, that we are just filtering people towards better opportunities or towards existing opportunities as opposed to really building a foundation of strong education. So Germany, for example, has a very strong apprenticeship program. And so by the time kids reach class 10 in Germany, a lot of them don't even do, 2 more years of school. They'll go to carpentry school, or they'll become nurses, or, they go straight to medical school to become doctors. And I think that's something really interesting that we could try over here. I also think that, many people might disagree that we've also over-prioritized college for a lot of people. And better than, going
but
to...
But that, like you very, very aptly later talk about, it has a class and caste question as well.
Exactly,
because your work is connected to caste as well.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
But, nowadays, something in Silicon Valley, and I know in Bangalore as well, there's some startups that are doing this, is that you can become a software programmer online. And, there's, it's called Lambda School in the US. In India, there's, I think it's called Masai School, where anyone, you can be a housewife and you take, coding classes, and in 2-3 years, these people are getting amazing jobs. And so, you don't even need an undergrad level, education for that. So I think, these types of innovative ideas are the ones that are going to work. And also just sort of deprioritizing the education system we have right now, because, nature abhors a vacuum. So the few IITs that were built, in the 50s that I write about are the same good ones today. Yeah. And then you had these private folks, who come in to fill in the gaps, particularly in South India and Andhra Pradesh. And they're sort of connected to a local politician. And then there's the whole land mafia. So it's, it's become this big business. And what gets lost in the business is actual education.
To even find that kind of dignity of labor, you'll have to deeply eradicate the caste question. Because because what you're saying, this overemphasis of college education is also a very Brahminical understanding of what education might be. It's the use of the mind as the higher thing than the use of hands or or use of the body as such, right? So, I really liked, you quoted here from Amartya Sen and John Drez's book, Islands of California in a Sea of Sub-Saharan Africa, as this is described as the Indian case, the particular Indian case. And so I'll move to your next chapter, which is Economic Aspirations. And this is as dreary a chapter as the first one. This is, again, a whole list of failures of the state, of being unable to provide jobs, of the private sector not being able to reach out to the millions as they should have and create new jobs. Questions about job security is still lying very much with the government sector, and that's why a lot of young people in smaller towns and villages wanting those kind of jobs and working for years to get one such job. And I know this because I come from a small town called Asansol. All the young men and women that I knew in Asansol wanted a railway job, actually. Railway still stands like number one, railway, SBI. These are the jobs that people wanted because it's for life and you get a pension at the end, you're set. I was also looking at the questions you raise about the gig economy, right? So the Uber and the Swiggies of the world and their nature of exploitation that happens there. So here in this chapter, I was really wanting to understand, do you think, from your survey of talking to people, that even entrepreneurship or the startup that a lot of young people today talk about, even in small towns, is only possible with a certain kind of background in financial capital or social capital in the form of networks? Or is it possible to break the barrier with more innovative ways? You give some examples, and they're very exciting. So if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so to answer your question, I think to break your question apart, the first half about existing levels of privilege, you're seeing that slowly erode now. Particularly in Bangalore, there's a lot of first-time entrepreneurs who've come from very different backgrounds who've traditionally not had access to capital. Baiju's, I know, is very polarizing, but Baiju himself, comes from a very humble background, and now, he's worth more than Anand Mahindra and many people who've, had these family businesses, for generations. And you're seeing more stories like that. Even the founder of Oyo is from a very small town in Odisha. And yes, there's still, some sort of caste hegemony that's playing out. But you're also seeing that in India that, capital is flowing more to small towns and cities in the last 5 or 10 years that did not happen in liberalization. So, but there is a big question about the gig economy. And I'm sort of 50-50 on this because, and what I write in the book is that many people who drive for Zomato, they don't have any other alternatives. So it's still money that they're making that they would not have made, being in their village. But at the end of the day, it's extremely exploitative work. So for example, when Zomato announced, paid parental leave and, these amazing things, it was for everyone in their offices, their white collar staff.
Not really the delivery men and women.
Exactly. And those people, for a long time, they were paying for their own insurance. That they lacked, basic security that, gig workers elsewhere in the world have, including in the US.
Also, exploitative because it's also like if you're late, then you are penalized, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And the Zomato ad, the Katrina Kaif ad where he goes to deliver her food, and he's like, "Oh my God, this is Katrina Kaif, and I want to get a picture with her." And by the time that she comes back out, he leaves. The Zomato driver leaves because he has to make another delivery. Zomato pulled that ad because, people were like, this is really tone deaf and this does not reflect well on you. And at the end of the day, the unit economics for these drivers are not good at all. So I write about Uber. I had a series of conversations with the high-level executive at Uber. The conclusion I arrive at is that in the gig economy, the game is always rigged against the workers. And so what Uber does is they have an algorithm where they determine, supply and demand. And they determine a salary that every driver should roughly make in Indian cities. So in Delhi, it can be 20,000 a month. In Calcutta, it's 14,000. In Bangalore, it's a little bit higher. What that means is that no matter how the actual economy is doing, because Uber regulates supply and demand, the driver is only going to make the same amount of money. And so, if there's a lot of demand but not enough supply, the driver is not going to make more money. If I wanted to drive for Uber tomorrow, I can't. because I need a commercial driver's license and things like that. Whereas in other parts of the world, the gig economy gives you flexibility to really study for law school and drive for Uber, or to, have two jobs and, make some supplemental income. But over here, that's not the case because so many people use it as a full-time job. So you really need to, we need to figure out a way where there's some more security, because otherwise it's these men who have families and are risking a lot in these jobs with very little, actual money that they're making.
There are two lovely stories that you talk about the internet, and it's connected to jobs and economic aspiration. Nazneen's story of starting a beauty parlor at home, and you talk about Sumit, the Dalit rap icon who uses the internet. So I'm going to connect your earlier chapter of economic aspiration to the next one about technology and social media. While at one end, there is this huge benefit that the internet, social media, technology has given to break the traditional entry barriers to a lot of things, and therefore one could say making the economy more democratic in a certain way. But on the other hand, what it has also done, as you mentioned, is it has flattened debates, it's taken out nuances from our understanding of the world and how we interact with each other. So if you were to sum up the impact of technology and social media, as you have seen on millennials, what would you say?
I'd say net, it's been very positive. And, precisely why, to share with the audience, the two people Arundhati just mentioned. One of them, her name is Nazneen. She's a woman I met who, was a domestic abuse survivor, and she left an abusive marriage and came home to Hyderabad to her parents a couple of months pregnant. And she just started, during her pregnancy, she just started watching these videos on YouTube all day long. And they were these makeup tutorials. And then she has her kid and she realizes, well, I need to do something. And what do I know? I know how to apply makeup. And so she just started applying makeup on, girls in her neighborhood. Then it eventually became bridal makeup. Then it eventually led to her hiring someone. Then that led to her opening her own salon and hiring many other people. And how did she get her clients? She got her clients on Facebook and WhatsApp. They became her word of mouth. And her teacher, of course, was YouTube. And, this is a very uniquely millennial story. And it's a positive story that I don't know if someone in her position would have ever been able to, have 20 years ago. Yeah. And it was made possible today because of the internet, because of social media. I also write about someone named Sumit Samos, who's a Dalit rapper from Odisha. And in 2016, he started uploading these rap videos. And after Rohit Vemula's suicide in Hyderabad, one of his videos went viral. And he, was invited to rap at concerts in India, and then in Paris, in Mauritius. And just this year, actually, he got into Oxford on a master's program, but they didn't give him a scholarship. So he went to social media, he went to Twitter and Facebook, and he crowdfunded 45 lakhs to go to Oxford, and he's there right now. And, imagine that, imagine that story even 10 years ago, that, a Dalit boy from Odisha, doing any of these things and making it to Oxford on a crowdfunded scholarship. Yeah. And so I know that, a lot of discourse has been coarsened on social media. But at the end of the day, it's just also the internet has just made so many opportunities available that a young woman in Bhopal has the same access to information and opportunities as a young man in Bangalore or in Delhi or in Dehradun or in any of these places. And that's the real beauty of the internet. Of course, social media, there's the whole regulation debate, but the net positives definitely outweigh the negatives.
Yeah, and talking about young Dalit men, Jignesh Mewani, he raised his entire capital for running his campaign from Gujarat on ourdemocracy.in. So there are these possibilities that one couldn't imagine this before, right? We always said good people can't join politics because you don't have the cash that you need to actually run campaigns, right?
Exactly.
So this part was fascinating, which I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to talk about some of the statistics you give, right, in the next series about your next chapter on social values. 80% of millennials believe religion is important. 50% believe in religion over science. 14% believe in science over religion. 60% feel that you should ban films and books if they hurt religious sentiments. And 6% believe in love marriage. honestly, I may have picked up the wrong ones, but I shuddered. I shuddered for many reasons, but mostly I shuddered thinking that I have, as somebody who's going to be 50 next year, I've learned a lot from my young colleagues at work. And I shuddered to think that what some of these things indicate is a preference of tradition and learned knowledge, a learned behavior over deciding for yourself what you want. A certain throwing away of opportunity to judge for yourself. That's what was hitting me more than saying religion, faith is more important than science. What it really meant was, what does then that religion, faith mean? So I felt worried. Are you?
I'm not trying to be diplomatic, but I'm not taking a position on this because, in a lot of ways, my role in writing this book is to share the stories of Indian millennials and not to sort of put my own opinion in here. Something interesting, though, in the figures you cited is the more educated millennials are, the more they favor religion over science. And that's the survey that found that. It's on the same page, So, in fact, that the CSDS study found that those who were less educated tended to favor science more over religion, and as you get more educated, you favor religion more over science. About religion and spirituality, in a lot of ways, it's about identity. And it's also why the education thing makes sense, because in today's day and age, and the plus sides of the internet is that you have all of this access, but the downside is that everyone kind of is the same. And what that means is that you're looking for this identity that you might not get in your job. So like, my identity is not the job I have. My identity are the interests I have, or the communities I'm a part of. And in a large part of India, the communities that people are members of are their religious communities or their spiritual communities. So someone I met earlier this year, who's not in the book was done by then, is a young lady who was a follower of a cult, a sect in northern India and Haryana. And the cult founder had been arrested in 2017-18. There were rape allegations against him. I don't know if people are familiar with who I'm talking about. And she was still a hardcore follower of his. She still believed in him. And I asked her why, why is this? And she told me, number one, in her village in Haryana, she's not really allowed to leave the home after the sun sets. But when she's allowed to go to the ashram, nobody questions that, And then when she gets to the ashram, she has this purpose, and she has this physical environment where she can have other conversations with other young women and men her age that she cannot have in her village. So, she really has this liberation that she lacks in her real life and her non-spiritual life. And then finally, it gives her this identity that I'm Babaji's follower, and that identity you don't get. I said this on Twitter recently, I got some pushback, but you don't get that identity from saying I'm an atheist. Not a lot of people say I'm a proud atheist, but far more people will say I'm a proud Hindu, I'm a proud Christian, I'm a proud Muslim, I'm a proud Buddhist, because it gives you this identity that otherwise people are not, they lack in their everyday lives.
So you make this very interesting point, and these two characters that you talk about, Basant and Riddhi. So Basant is this young man who's progressive and liberal in some parts of his life. Up to a point. Yeah. And therefore has chosen the person who he has got married to. The caste did not matter. They both work. They travel together, as you explain. On the other hand, he has very conservative and rigid ideas about politics and what India should be, and that it should be a kind of a Hindu Rashtra. And there, his ideas seemed very limited in terms of allowing for multiple voices to be around. Similarly with Riddhi as well. She comes from a very conservative place where she has to come home from work and immediately go into the kitchen and help her mother-in-law and the other bahus of the house to look after the men. And yet the question she asks is exactly the kind of questions that any feminist would ask, I would say. So we see these different colors on the same people. And you say very nicely at that part that if there is anything that is a truism in India, it is these contradictions in the same person. So, from talking to so many people, how do you think people live with these contradictions? Don't they see them conflict in their lives, or do they negotiate? Have they kept it in different compartments? How is it possible for them to live?
I mean, I think this is not endemic to India. This you have all over the world, where this paradox exists. For a lot of millennials, and in the US also, you're seeing this play out, where you're seeing this on the left and the right, that the left is not as liberal as they claim to be, and the right is not as traditionally conservative as they've said for decades they were. Family values mattered until a thrice divorced person got their nomination. So I think the paradox is not something unique to India, but it is something fascinating that Riddhi is like this Congress supporter I met, and I was so surprised because everywhere was doing my field work in northern India, I didn't meet any Congress supporters who were millennials. And then she had an arranged marriage because her sister had a love marriage which did not really work out because unke baitne ka tarika alag tha and all of that. And but she was she's raised by professionals, and she was telling me, and we both work. She and her husband both work, and they leave the home at basically the same time. But she has to wake up an hour and a half before him to make breakfast.
Yeah.
And then at 7, they both get back, and he lies down and watches Netflix, and she's like making dinner. And she says, I don't even mind doing it, but I don't want to be taken for granted. And I want some acknowledgement for the work I'm doing. And I've seen, shades of, this wherever I was doing my interviews, all over India. The other paradox, which I think, we might get to at a later stage, but, even in Kerala, it's a state that's very progressive at the surface level. But, in the Christian church in Kerala, people often don't know that it has a very deeply entrenched caste system. And in my book, I write about the murder of a young Dalit Christian man named Kevin, who fell in love with a Syrian Christian girl. And in the hierarchy, the Syrian Christians, at the top, and the Dalit Christians are not. And he was murdered by the girl's family. And the interesting thing is that the girl's parents, the dad was Christian, but the mom was Muslim. So it's not even like the mom was a Syrian Christian, but the mom was upper class. So you really have this a triangle of caste, class, and status that played out in this story. And I met so many millennials even in Kerala who are have very different views from other parts of India on certain things. But then the arranged marriage and all of that is also very common over there.
Also, I mean, with lots of my women friends in Kerala who've grown up in Kerala, swear by how misogynistic the society is, and how it's so difficult for a woman to actually go out and get a drink. And anybody who's traveled to Kerala would know, I know, it's really hard. And it has the highest level of literacy.
Yes.
It has the highest level of women's literacy. And in so many other ways, and also progressive politics, etc., etc. So it's very difficult to put these things together, right? That's another kind of paradox that one lives with.
To be totally fair, it's difficult for anyone to get a drink in Kerala. So,
Okay.
I mean, not just women.
Yes, accepted.
I've done a lot of fieldwork there.
I would just say men find it slightly easier than women.
But it's hard.
It's hard. Yes, it is hard. What I missed actually is any conversation around the queer community. I have learned so much about other ways of being, sexual orientation, the queer world from my younger friends. And I think my generation growing up, we were all in the closet. None of us actually would even have the language or the words of rights or acknowledgement or identity. And many people from the younger communities have shown us, how to be. So I was wondering, did you meet people who were queer who didn't want to talk or wanted to talk? How did you deal with that question?
So, to be totally honest with you, when you're doing fieldwork in India, particularly as a man traveling alone, it's often difficult to, even ask basic questions because you have to establish a level of comfort with the person you're talking to. I know a lot of, women user researchers as well who find it hard to talk to other women, even when they travel together, because you have to have that level of comfort. Like in a lot of small towns I went to, I was honestly very scared to talk to anybody over there because, one thing you say wrong and
You'll have a situation.
Exactly. So to be totally honest with you, it's not a question I really asked a lot of people because it's in India, it's so taboo. And it's so, if someone was willing to share that with me, I would obviously, ask more questions. But it's something only people in urban areas with a certain level of comfort or security talk about openly.
Right.
And what I mean by comfort and security is that, either supportive parents or a stable job that allows you
Or
to live
peer
on your own,
groups and social
or peer
support
groups that
groups.
support you.
Yeah.
And so it's not something that, people talk about openly in India, and it's definitely still, definitely in the closet.
Yeah, I understand that this must have been really difficult. So, okay, let's move on to the next chapter. Very exciting, political attitudes. So, there's a lot that Vivaan puts in terms of his understanding of why politics looks the way it does today, the role that millennials play and will play in the politics of the future. I was very struck with something that you say, that millennials want, like, prefer, quote unquote, bold action. And therefore, as he mentions, from demonetization to surgical strikes, all of them are seen as this bold action. And part of why the current regime and its proponents are popular is because they are seen as people who can take these bold actions. And there's also a sense of pride in being citizens of a country that takes bold actions, right? So I was wondering, did you find a sort of negative associated with gentle, kind, supportive? And I'm using these words as to provoke you, obviously. And you know, the way Rahul Gandhi is called Pappu, and that's exactly that, right? That's the almost like saying the feminine male. On the other hand, you have the inches of chest and the whole shore around, the Josh around a certain kind of masculinity, which is the nation's language, sort of, right? So what do you think is so attractive about it to millennials who themselves are maybe more in touch with their feelings and sensitiveness and humanness than many in our generation? Or am I wrong to suppose that?
I love talking about millennials and politics because I've asked a lot of questions, I've written a lot about it, and we can have 10 different conversations. Millennials in India are the biggest supporters of the BJP and the Prime Minister. And they vote for the BJP on an average of 3 points higher than the national average. And in 2014, many millennials were first-time voters and they broke very heavily for the BJP. Now, 2014, that was because, he was the new kid on the block. And he was promising 100 million new jobs and bullet trains and Acche Din, everything, right? Like, who would not want that? In 2019, none of that was delivered, but people liked him even more. And why did they like him even more? So number one is the bold action that you mentioned, that, I spoke to someone in she was in Mysore, who works at Infosys, and she was telling me how badly demonetization had affected her family because her father-in-law needed to be admitted to hospital. And this is an Infosys employee, very highly educated woman. And she didn't have money, but she still loved demonetization and she loved the Prime Minister for doing it because at least he's doing something. At least he's taking on the corrupt elites. At least someone is finally doing something, were the words she had, told me. Similar, about the surgical strikes, that, this guy, he's keeping us safe. He's going to really strike Pakistan. And I think there's a term, ghar mein ghus ke maar diya, went into the house and hit them. And people love that. And then there's, of course, the nexus with social media and how this plays out on the internet, which I think I'd love to cover as well. But what I'm really getting to is that this is a uniquely millennial thing that is also not necessarily unique to India. Because if you look at Bernie Sanders, he's also, he promises these big, bold, it's systemic change and, tear down the old system. And that's kind of what Modi is doing over here, right? He's tearing down the old elites. He's replacing the Lutyens elite with his own saffron elite. And what I write is that millennials want leaders who speak, pray, and look like them. And what that means is that Modi speaks the language of aspiration, and he's talking about, making India shine abroad. So even if your own life you're not doing well, at least your country is doing well, and you have a patriotic duty to re-elect the person who's providing that. Again, I'm just I'm providing you the responses I heard. Number two is actually language, because in large parts of Hindi-speaking India, they were governed by people who did not necessarily connect with the people who were voting them in. And then you have Modi, who comes, onto the scene, and he speaks in Hindi, not just in India, but even in New York and in London and in Sydney. And these foreign leaders have to listen to him. And the thinking is that if he could do it, so can I. Because most of India does not speak English. Most of India speaks Hindi and then regional languages, Kannada and Telugu and Malayalam and all of that. And so the thinking is that, if you're a small town millennial from a Hindi speaking state, and if Modi could do it, if he could rise up from absolute poverty and become the prime minister, so can I. And so going to your question about gentleness, Rahul Gandhi does not have that life story that people outside of Lutyens Delhi can relate to, because he has not struggled for anything, and he has not risen up from anywhere to this was all given to him. But the other non-Modi and non-BJP leaders who are doing exceedingly well all have similar stories. If you look at Mamta Banerjee in Bengal, she defied all odds to win her re-election, and her story is the exact same as his. She is a proud Bengali woman who stands up for the Bengali identity, who came up from the streets and fought her way up there. And people love that, right?
And is secular.
And is secular. But what I'm getting to is that, so if you take Modi out of it and if you take Mamta out of it, but look at the traits. The traits are about, pride and the life story that we can relate to. And most importantly, about stability and security, because Indians by and large do not want to get a beer with their president or their prime minister, but they want their prime minister to take care of them and to keep them safe. And the whole Mamta Banerjee's Didi, elder sister keeps you safe. Modi, in a lot of Hindi-speaking states where I went, in Madhya Pradesh, people would say, "Wo to hamare guardian hai." He's our guardian. In UP, a journalist I know heard millennials calling Modi Pita, father. And because, he's the one who provides us with, security. And that's why they changed their Twitter handles to Chaukidar ABC, Chaukidar DEF, because people want to feel protected. And they also want to favor their leaders.
Two different things, one in the UK and one in the US. When one looks at millennials really, and also the generation Z, which is the one after the millennials, there has actually been a surge of people believing less and less in neoliberal economics. There being therefore more Democrats among that age group in the US and more people joining the Labour Party, especially when Corbyn gave that huge call. There were a number of young people joining in the UK. And it seemed to me that from an understanding of this broad thing, that younger people were actually trying to look back to say, was there anything good about socialism that we can bring back in terms of the same reasons? Lack of security for jobs, not knowing how future looks, insecurity about things like state welfare, which is taken for granted in some of these countries. They were all in shambles, and therefore young people actually started wondering whether right-wing economics or capitalism or this kind of idea and the divisiveness of that politics, whether that's really good for them or not. But in India, I see the similarities, but it's like just toppled over. Why do you think that is in the Indian case?
The BJP and no real Indian party is actually economically or fiscally right-wing. Modi in 2019 ran a statist or welfarist campaign, and that campaign was about toilets and it was about the 6,000 rupees to the farmers, right? And I met a lot of farmers who, that's a lot of money for a lot of people. And having a toilet when you never had a toilet earlier makes a huge difference. And the thing is that if you look at the 2000, I don't want to get too academic, but if you look at the 2004 Indian election, macroeconomically, India did amazingly well, right? All of this money was pouring into the country, and they ran an India Shining campaign. The only issue was that people in the villages didn't feel that way. And the Congress ran a very pro-welfare campaign, and they won. Nobody expected them to win, and they won. So the BJP realized this, and they said, we are not going to win on right-wing economics. That's why it also took them so long to privatize Air India. And the only time Modi has actually backed down has been when Rahul Gandhi attacked him over land acquisition and said, "Ye to suit boot ki sarkar hai." And he actually backed down. And that was a fairly fiscally right-wing, measure they were going to take, but they didn't do it. It still hasn't been done. Because in every party in India offers some level of socialism. It just sort of depends on, how much of socialism you're going to get, but you are going to get high chunks of it. And so in India, the programs that really do well are welfare programs. So in Madhya Pradesh, where I've done a lot of my field work in the 2018 state elections, the two parties were fighting with each other in how many welfare schemes can we give. So one person's offering 10,000 unemployment allowance, the other guy is doing 12,000. One person's offering 10,000 at the time of marriage to a girl, the other one's offering 15,000. But no one is actually saying, okay, we're going to create these schemes to get jobs over here. No, that was not even a part of the conversation because it doesn't resonate. I'd much rather get a welfare program than, a job that might never materialize and I might not be even able to do because if I'm a woman, I'll get married and I might have to stay at home. And if I'm a man, I might have to go back to the farm for 4 months of the year. And how can I ever undertake a formal job?
So while you were doing the research is also when we saw the anti-CAA movement happening, at least in the cities, in the big cities. Was it totally absent in the small towns?
This is a question I've received before about the support against CAA among young people. And this is very much a very urban phenomenon. So in Delhi, I can speak to it being a JNU, South Delhi, Gurgaon, East Delhi type of, particular type of young person who came out. And I'd assume the same, in Bangalore and in Mumbai and in all of that. In Mumbai, it happened in Kolaba. I think we know the demographics of Kolaba. At the end of the day, these policies are incredibly widely supported among young Indians. And by that I mean CAA and NRC. That, hey, we have limited resources, we have to keep them for ourselves. We can't let it go to the Bangladeshi or the Pakistani or, whoever. I'll be honest, I'm not super familiar with the CAA and when the cutoff date is, but I think that a lot of people who are actually like the Bangladeshis, Hindus who are being persecuted right now, I actually don't think they're eligible under CAA. They're not, right? Yeah, exactly. And so that's real persecution that's happening. But those people are never going to, get the rewards of whatever rewards exist. But yeah, so net, like at the end of the day, these are very, widely supported policies.
This book is full of these amazing, interesting, exciting characters that you've decided to talk about them. There's Ravindra, Gagan, Vinita, Sajid, Nazneen, Priyanka, Radhe. I found all of their stories so interesting and they sort of give color to an otherwise like more statistical, insightful kind of book. You said you did 900 interviews, right? How did you choose the ones that you wanted in the story? And secondly, do you think you have something in mind where all the 900 stories might be on some website or somewhere, which can further help other researchers who are looking at this? Or how do you plan to do that?
Oh, that's actually a really good idea. I haven't thought about it, putting all 900 online. It's a great question about who to include and who to leave out. And at the end of the day, I really wanted to talk about regular people who we don't often always hear from in the media. And if you watch Bollywood, and I'm talking about Bollywood in particular because not all Indian cinema is as much in a bubble as Bollywood is. But if you predominantly watch Bollywood movies and read, watch certain channels or read certain newspapers, you would have a totally different image of India than what actually exists. And so the whole purpose of my book was to talk about really average, ordinary people who are representative of this generation. And so some of these people are doing extraordinary things, and they might not reflect the data. And then some of these people are completely representative of the data, and we need to be talking about them. Like, we need to talk about how many young women are not, treated fairly in their domestic situations, and how it's still incredibly difficult, no matter how educated you are, to break out of the situations you were born into. And so I basically wanted to talk about people that we don't often hear from in the media, and that's sort of where I came from in including the stories and the anecdotes in the book.
Some people had asked you, especially the education and economic aspiration, that how is this a millennial problem? Wasn't this always the situation in India? And I really liked your response. So if you would like to share that, why is it specifically a millennial question?
Thank you. And then, it's always been like this. What's different is that the whole expectation from liberalization and from previous generations is that this generation will be different, right? This generation is going to be the generation of nation builders. And this generation, I remember, when the Beijing Olympics happened in 2008, I was a teenager, and it was incredible, the bird's nest, and seeing, the images of China. And back then, India was growing so fast, the first 8-9 years. And there was this expectation, at least in Delhi, and I think over here as well, that it was just a matter of time, like 5 years, maybe a decade, before India catches up to China. But, it's 13 years now, and the gap has widened. And the whole thing was that millennials are going to be the one who really build India and take it forward. But most of the millennials who I met, particularly the older millennials, are now, they believe the ship has sailed for them, and they've missed the bus, and now it's the next generation. And I'm like, that's the real tragedy. And my book is not, supposed to be a positive, sunny story. It's a call to action that, let's do what we can while we can still, have some type of impact. Because previous generations had sort of accepted, okay, there's socialism, the economy hasn't opened up, it's still a poor country, recovering from colonialism. But that all got over a long time ago. And this is really, the years that India has, and Indian millennials and our youth has, to really make something of ourselves.
Yeah, I was left with a very, I must say, a sad feeling at the end of the book. Not just because my generation is the one previous to that, so you can't totally forego feeling responsible partly for it and being complicit in what you're talking about, but also because I felt, at least as a 70s generation, we had hope. And we had certain dreams. The 80s generation, as we say, beginning of the millennials, they were born into a world where there were so many things that were supposed to happen, and none of that did. So I think that kind of crashed even before it took off, which seems quite sad. And therefore, when I look at it, I see a very anxious, a very insecure, but superbly talented and wanting to do things, full of energy kind of a person, feeling totally trapped in the social political scenario of this country. And that's really the sad part.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The aspiration, right?
The aspiration is there, but there's nothing that you can do about it, because it won't allow you to.
Exactly.
And if you do make it well, it's sheer luck sometimes and nothing else. Thanks, Vivan, for writing this book. I think it'll be a very useful tool from marketing and brand managers to educationists to people making policy, but also political mobilizers. I think it's a very insightful book for anybody who is in the profession, designers, who is in the profession of making something for millennials, either in a commercial way or in any other way. So thank you so much. One of the things that I had wondered, that does he have insider bias? He's a millennial. Is this book going to be, not colored by his? And I think, Vivaan, you've done a wonderful job of not once making me feel that there is that insider bias. So thanks, Vivaan.
Thank you for staying on for the full conversation. If you liked what you heard, please share it with family and friends. You can also leave us a review on iTunes or Apple Podcasts. The crew that makes these podcasts possible are Gaurav Krishna and Ishan Gupta on sound supervision and production, with support from S. Sarvanaraj and Raghavendra Tenkaila. Artwork and design is by Chandani Venkataraman of Crisscross Design Studios. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. It can also be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcenter.org. Do follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter to get regular updates on our programming. This is Lekha Naidu signing off on behalf of everyone at BIC.